Hi class, so today I want to just give you a brief chat about Princess Mononoke. I hope you're feeling well. Today I got a little sun, maybe you can see I'm a little bit sunburned. I was able to get outside, which was nice. So let's talk about the film. I appreciate all the comments that you guys have made in the forum. They're very insightful, and just want to give you some additional comments and some background. Mononoke is Japanese to mean spirit or monster, so I think that gives us some insight into when we talk about Princess Mononoke, what she really is. Um, and also a little bit about Shintoism, which is the traditional religion of Japanese culture, which is animistic, which is that it views nature as being alive. I think that's quite evident in the film. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But it also reflects on the concept of people are part of the animal world. So this goes back to some of the previous weeks where we talked about companion species. So just to keep that in mind. The setting of the film is the late Muromachi period, approximately 1336 to 1573. But it's also a symbolic netherworld. And I put some links on the slide you can see to these ideas of the Jomon, Yamato, and Emishi people, proto-races of ancient Japan, if you want to research that a little bit more on your own. Not necessary for this week's analysis. Another comment, which is interesting, is that Miyazaki was inspired by John Ford Westerns. This idea of frontier town on the edge of chaos, you can see that with the Iron Town. They're very kind of similar to the Westerns of the 1930s and 1940s. It was interesting when I chose this film for this course, I could not find any eco-cinema readings on Miyazaki, which I find quite shocking because I think he's probably a prototypical eco-cinema filmmaker. So I don't know if scholars are in the process of creating materials and they'll be coming out in the near future. I honestly, I don't know, but when I tried to find a reading specifically about eco-cinema and Miyazaki, I could not. Okay, so how is wilderness portrayed differently or similarly than American films? I think the primary difference is Shintoism, the idea that nature is alive. And you really get a sense of that in the way that nature is animated here. It's very different than the way American films that we've watched up to this point depict wilderness as something kind of separate from the human world. At least in this film or this period of history, Miyazaki is showing humans embedded in the natural world, that they're part of the natural world, that they can communicate with spirits. I think the only equivalent you might find in American cinema is with Native Americans, who might be shown as being more spiritually connected to the natural world. What are the competing ideologies in the film? I'm going to go in the next slide. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But clearly it's anthropocentric versus ecocentric worldview. And that leads to the next point, which is this concept of evil from the West. I commented in some of your posts that the West, I think, is a stand-in symbolizes Western technology, Western culture, the idea of industrialization, progress coming from, if you've studied the history of Japan, it's at various different points had been colonized by Western imperialist powers. And so the West is considered sort of perhaps having corrupted the purity of ancient Japanese culture. So I think that's a hint towards this idea that this ideology of anthropocentrism is a contamination that comes from the West. So this slide comes from the video essay that I posted in your extra credit for viewing if you want to watch on your own. And you see on this axis the spiritual realm here, and then the imperial or material realm here. And then this other axis, the Emishi people are the villagers, the peasants that work on the land, who live in the grass huts. And then over here is civilization. So you see that civilization is represented by the iron ball and the industrialization. It's encroaching upon this life. And then the Ashitaka character, he sort of mediates between all these things. He's kind of in the middle of the spiritual realm and the realm of humans, of men. Also, he's sort of in between the encroachment of civilization and the Emishi people. So I think this is kind of an interesting graphic that sort of helps show us sort of the competing ideologies and forces going on in this film. Some of you commented in your forum comments that you thought there was a conflict primarily between animals and humans, but I don't know if that's really the case, because as you see here, animals and humans are, in terms of the more greater spiritual realm of the forest, are actually quite equal. So I would say it's more of a conflict between the sort of spiritual side of the forest and then the encroachment of the emperor's patriarchal needs and desires to harness these resources for progress. Okay, so how is the forest spirit or night walker different than other films we've seen? Does this reverse the anthropocentric gaze? Yes, I mean, I chose this actual image on the left because there were a few times where the forest spirit actually looks us straight in the eye. So how often have we had this opportunity in the films that we've watched up to this point, where the spiritual force of nature actually looks back at us as opposed to us looking back at them? So I think this also is a way that the film differentiates itself from other movies that we've watched, where here nature is truly alive, that it's not some kind of inert material matter that's beautiful and sublime, but it's somehow separate. But here, through animation, and in my talk about the power of animation, is that animation brings the nature realm, it animates it to life, it brings it to life, which is, I think, unique in what we've seen up to this point. So Irontown is an example of Lewis Mumford's concept of the mega machine. So mega machine is this idea that before the advent of capitalism and industrialization, that there have been societies in the past, in the ancient world, that created a society that became a machine itself, like in ancient Egypt, where all the people that built the pyramids were like machine parts. Or in other examples throughout time where you had slavery, you have people becoming machine parts, and then later they get replaced by machines. And you see, I have this picture of the iron foundry. You can see on the left here, it's the people, they're not machines, that are actually running this foundry. So I think this is an early example of a mega machine. I don't think that Miyazaki is aware of Lewis Mumford's concept, but in any case, I think it's an example of that. So in terms of the question, is this an ecofeminist film? I think most of you agree that there's certainly ecofeminist characters, such as San, but then you had the female leader of Irontown, also a woman, so people argued, well, since she's a female, then it can't be an ecofeminist film. But I think that she's serving the patriarchy, so in that sense, whatever actions she takes, such as shooting the boar with a gun here, I chose the actual still with the gun here, to highlight the point that she's the one who's introducing the technology and the corrupting influence of the West to this particular environment. So she's at the forefront of man's role on Earth. In terms of what does the iron ball signify, I think I'll defer to your comments, because I think all of you wrote very strong comments. I think iron symbolizes quite a few things, but in my ultimate reading, I think it represents the concept of greed. One thing that's interesting about Miyazaki's films is that, unlike Disney, where Disney has this cartoonish, sorry for the pun, but quite literally cartoonish vision of good versus evil, where characters are purely good or purely evil. One thing I like about Miyazaki, and perhaps this is also true with sort of non-Hollywood movies, is that there is no purely good or evil character. I mean, Lady Ibashi, even though she is the antagonist of this film, seems to have good rationalizations for her actions. In other words, whatever actions she chooses, she's motivated for reasons that make sense to her, at least. And I think all the characters have that as well, and that there's, each character has both positive and negative characteristics. And this is very typical Miyazaki films. So if you watch his other movies, I encourage you to pay attention to that particular aspect of his movies, which I think is wonderful. I like movies where your characters are neither good or bad, but sort of somewhere in between. Okay, last but not least, another thing I want to point out about Japanese filmmaking and Japanese animation in particular is their use of ambient pauses. So, Western films are very moving, action's always moving, always following the characters, always moving forward, always sort of pulling you along. But Japanese films in particular don't do that. They stop, they pause, they breathe. There's always these shots where you can look at drops on the water or look up at the trees and see the sunlight, which I think is quite interesting. And I like this characteristic of Japanese films, and that's one of the reasons that attracts me to Japanese film. Last but not least, this idea of the romantic sublime in Western civilization and Western culture that we've talked about, and this idea of wild nature. Do we find that present in the Miyazaki film? I'm going to argue no, because the sublime is always in awe of something, in awe of nature, as something that's kind of outside of us, that's inspiring us. But I don't think that the animistic characteristics of this movie convey that. I think all of us are a part of the spirituality and the nature that Miyazaki is depicting. And that's especially true when we look at, the forest spirit looking back at us, acknowledging us, returning our gaze, including us. So I think that would make this type of movie distinctly different from Western films that we've watched. Okay, that's it for today. I'll see you next week when we talk about Okja. Thank you. Bye.